One might argue that if Vesna had simply kept her eyes on the floor, like she had every day for 6 years, the Alpha King would never have seen her at all. But then again, if the king had troubled himself to notice that his own tithe bread was poisoning the children who ate it, she would never have had to look up. So really, when you turned it over in your hands, the whole disaster was his fault. Every last crumb of it. She had gotten very good at not being seen. It was a craft, like the salvage she ground or the fevers she broke. Every morning before the bells, Vesna rubbed a thumb of hearth ash along her jaw and down the hollows under her eyes, until the light stopped catching anywhere on her face. She wound the gray wrap twice around her hair, once under her chin. She tucked a knot of bitter wormwood and old smoke into the collar of her shift, so that anyone who came close enough to breathe her in got nothing but the smell of a sick room and a cold Great Plain, forgettable. A gray smudge at the edge of the hall, that the eye slid off of the way water slides off oiled wool. It had kept her alive 6 years, and kept her free, which in Ashmere Hold was the rarer thing of the two. "You've got that face on," said Junia, without looking up from the linens. "I have one face," Vesna said. "It's the only one I own. You've got the face that means you're about to tell someone something they don't want to hear." Junia snapped a sheet flat between her hands. "It's tithe day just once. Could you let the hall rot in peace?" Tithe day filled the great hall of Ashmere with the whole of the lower city. Every wolf who owed grain or coin or labor to the hold come to pay it and be fed once, in return, from the king's own stores. It was the one day the crown was meant to remember. It had people underneath it. Mostly it was noise and elbows. And Vesna kept to the shadow of the third pillar with her satchel, because someone always fainted or split a knuckle, and it was always her they came for. Pell found her there, breathless. The way Pell found everyone. "Marek's here," he said. "Up on the dais already, eating like he paid for it." "Lords eat," Vesna said. "It's what they're for." Pell's ears had gone red. "The way he looks." Vesna felt the old cold slide down her spine, familiar as her own name. The way to survive a man like Marek was to be nothing he'd ever bothered to look at twice. And she had made herself very thoroughly into nothing. Let him look at the pretty ones. Then the child began to choke. She heard it before she understood it. A wet, tearing sound from the low tables near the door, where the poorest of the city sat with their portion of tithe bread and thin ale. A woman screamed. Vesna was moving before her mind had caught up with her feet, satchel banging her hip, shoving through the press of bodies with her shoulder down. The boy was small, 6 or 7, blue at the lips, both hands clawing at his throat. His mother had him by the shoulders and was shaking him, the worst thing she could have done. The crowd had pulled back into a ring, gawping. "Useless. He's not choking," Vesna said, dropping to her knees. She got a thumb into the corner of his mouth, airway clear, but the lips were wrong, not the dusky blue of a blocked throat, but a bruised, creeping violet, foam pink tinged at the corner, not choking, poisoned. What did he eat? "Look at me, what did he eat?" Just the bread," the mother sobbed. "The tithe bread. Same as everyone." Vesna's head came up. "Same as everyone." All down the low tables, the tithe bread sat in its dark loaves, the free bread, the king's charity, baked from the bottom of the stores where the old grain went, the damp grain, the swept-up grain that sat too long in a storehouse no one had troubled to check. She knew that Violet, she had read about it in a book she was not supposed to have, ergot, spoilt rye. It grew in wet grain like a secret, and it did not care whose mouth it ended up in. "Stop eating," Vesna said. It came out too quiet. She got to her feet. "Stop eating the bread." The hall did not stop. It was 1,000 people and 100 conversations, and one gray woman's voice went into it like a pebble into a river. A steward near the dais frowned at her. the small frown of a man deciding whether she was worth the trouble of silencing. So Vesna did the thing she had spent 6 years never doing. She climbed onto the bench, pulled the wrap off her mouth so her voice would carry, and shouted with everything in her. Up the length of the great hall, toward the high table and the fat lord and the empty carved chair where a king was supposed to sit. The tithe bread is poisoned. It's ergo, the rye's gone bad. You're feeding the whole lower city spoilt grain, and it's killing children, that the hall heard. The silence came down, the way a roof comes down, all at once and from above. 1,000 faces turned. And Vesna, up on her bench with her wrap fallen and the ash smudged from where she'd wiped her mouth, felt every single one of them land on her at once, and understood, distantly, that she had just made herself the most looked-at person in Ashmere Hold. "You fool," said the small, cold voice she had listened to for 6 years. "You beautiful fool, now they'll see you." Down at the high table, Lord Merrick had set down his cup. And in the carved chair beside him, the king's chair, the empty chair, the chair that had stood empty for the 2 years its owner spent away at the Northern Wars, a man she had not seen sit down, was leaning forward into the light with his elbows on his knees, watching her the way a man watches the one bright thing in a dim room. He had not been there a moment ago. She would have sworn it. He was hooded still, travel-stained, as though he'd walked in off the road and dropped into the nearest seat. But she could see his mouth, and it was doing something she had no name for. Not shock, not anger, nothing she'd braced for. Something slower, something that had been waiting. "There you are," said the Alpha King quietly, as if she were late. For one long, ringing moment, Vesna did the only sensible thing left to her. She pretended he was talking to someone else. She got down off the bench and knelt back beside the boy, because the boy was real, and the man on the dais was a problem she could not afford, and pressed 2 fingers to the small throat and counted the flutter of his pulse against the roar of blood in her own ears. Fast, thready, but there. "Get him water, clean water, not ale, and a finger of salt in it, and make him bring it back up," she told the mother, and her hands did not shake, which she was proud of later, when she had time to be proud of anything. "It's early. He's small, but he's early. He'll live, if you're quick." She did all of this with her chin down and her shoulders rounded, folding herself small again, reaching for the invisibility that had never failed her. It failed her now. She could feel him looking, and that was the thing she had not understood until now, that being looked at by most people was a light thing, a glance you could shrug off, and being looked at by him was not. It settled over the back of her neck and down her spine, like a hand laid flat, warm and certain and unhurried, and it did not slide off. The ash did nothing. The wrap did nothing. The wormwood at her collar did nothing at all. He could see her under all of it. "Steward." The king's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "The bread. She's right, isn't she? Have it all pulled, every loaf, every table, and the storehouse it came from, sealed until someone with a working nose has walked it end to end." A pause, and find out who was meant to have done that already. There was a scramble. There is always a scramble when a king who has been away for 2 years speaks for the first time in his own hall. Servants ran. The dark loaves vanished off the tables. Somewhere a woman was weeping with relief, and somewhere else a steward was going, the particular gray of a man, realizing exactly whose fault this was going to be made to be. And through all of it, the king came down off the dais. He came the way water finds low ground, unhurried, inevitable, the crowd folding out of his path, without being told. He pushed the hood back as he came, and Vesna, still kneeling, got her first clean look at the face under it, and thought, with a clarity, she would spend months trying to unthink, "Oh, that isn't fair," because Torin Ashmere was not supposed to look like that. The portraits in the long gallery showed a boy, all jaw and duty, sent north to a war before he'd finished becoming anything. This was not that boy. This was what the boy had become out there in the cold. broad through the shoulders, weathered at the eyes, an old scar nicking one dark brow, and under it a gaze so pale and so direct that meeting it felt like being read out loud. He was not beautiful the way Marek was beautiful, all soft gold and appetite. He was beautiful the way a drawn blade is beautiful. You admired it and you did not touch it. He crouched in front of her, elbows on his knees, so that the whole hall had to watch its king put himself eye to eye with a gray smudge of a herb woman on the floor. "You knew what it was before you were close enough to see it," he said. "Lo, just for her. You smelled it. Anyone can smell. Spoilt rye, my lord, no." He said it gently, which was worse than if he'd said it hard. "They can't. I've stood in that hall an hour, and I couldn't. You did it from across the room, through 1,000 people, and a thumb of ash you've rubbed on your face, to make sure no one looks at you." His pale eyes moved over her, not the way Marek's eyes moved, not down her, but into her, patient and thorough cataloging. "Clever ash. Clever wormwood. Whoever taught you to hide, taught you well." His voice dropped further, until it was barely a breath, until it was a thing that existed only in the 6 inches of air between them. "It's just a pity it doesn't work on me." Everything in Vesna went very still. He knows. Not the beauty, she could have survived, the beauty. The beauty only meant a claim, only meant a fight, only meant running again to some other hold and some other gray corner. This was worse. This was the thing under the beauty, the thing in her scent, that the ash was really there to hide, the thing that had a name she never let herself think in daylight. "He knows what I am. You're mistaken, my lord," she said. Her voice came out, even. 6 years of practice, all of it spent for this one moment. "I'm the herb keeper. I ground your fever powders when you were a boy going north. That's all I am, is it?" He smiled. And it was not a cruel smile, and that undid her more than cruelty would have. "Then look at me and say it again, and I'll believe you." She looked at him. She had not meant to. Later, she would decide it was the single most expensive thing she ever did. And whatever he saw in her face when she did, whatever the ash and the rap and the 6 long years had failed in that one instant to hide, she watched it arrive in him, watched his breath change, watched the patient hunter's stillness crack into something startled and human and far too pleased. "There she is," Torrin said softly, wonderingly, exactly as he had from the dais. And then he stood and turned to the whole watching hall. And Vesna's blood went to ice because she understood he was about to say something, and the something a king said in a full hall could not be unsaid. And Lord Merrick had risen from the high table and was already coming down the steps with that soft gold smile, his eyes fixed on the woman the king was crouched over as though he had only just noticed there was treasure on the floor of a room he'd been eating in all day. Fear does to some people what wine does to others. It loosens the tongue. It kicks the door off the small, careful room where a sensible person keeps the things they mean never to say, and it sends them out into the open before the sensible person can stop them. Vesna had been sober her whole life. She had never in 6 years said a reckless word. She was about to make up for all of it at once. She got to her feet before the king could speak, before Merrick could reach her, before the thing could happen to her instead of being chosen by her, and said far too loud, "My lord king, grant me a boon." It stopped Torrin with his mouth already open, and stopped the whole hall a second time. You could hear the fire. "A boon," he repeated. Something glinted at the back of the pale eyes. Interest. She would learn to fear that glint. "You've been away 2 years." The words were coming now and she could not have called them back with both hands. "And in 2 years your storehouses have gone to rot. Your tithe bread has turned to poison, and not one of the men you left in charge caught it before a child did, with his own throat. That's not bad luck, my lord. That's what happens when the wolf at the top isn't looking. Somebody down here has been robbing your hold blind and feeding you the profits, and none of your fine stewards will ever be the one to tell you, because they're the ones doing it." "Careful," murmured someone near the dais. Merrick had stopped on the bottom step, no longer smiling. Every word of it was true, and she knew it the way she knew the ergot. From the inside, from the part of her that had never once been wrong, the part the crown had hunted her whole bloodline into ash for having. That was the terror, underneath the terror. She was a thing that could not lie and could not be lied to, standing in the open in a full hall. And every heartbeat she stood here was a heartbeat someone might work out why she was so certain. She had to make herself useful faster than she made herself dangerous. Hand him a reason to keep her. That wasn't the real reason. A traitor was a reason. A traitor would do. So here's my boon. Vesna lifted her chin, proud as anything, with no idea yet how far a lifted chin could fall. Give me the run of your storehouses and your ledgers. 30 days. I'll find the rot, and I'll name it, and I'll put the proof of it in your hand. Proof not one man alive can argue with. I can do it because I'm the one person in this hold, small enough that the thieves won't think to hide from me. Her heart was slamming so hard she thought he must be able to see it move, her gray shift, and, when it's done, when I've handed you your traitor, you let me go, unclaimed, unnamed. And you never say one more word about what you think you saw in my face just now. That's the price. That's the whole price. I dare you to pay it. I dare you. To a king, in front of his entire city, on the day he came home. It was, Vesna would reflect much later, possibly the stupidest sentence ever spoken in Ashmere Hold. And she had heard Pell speak. The hall detonated. She could not afterward have said which sound came first, Merrick's bark of outraged laughter, or the roar of the crowd, half scandal and half delight, or the stewards all shouting at once for the guards, for the girl to be taken down, for someone to do something about the mad herb woman who had just dared the Alpha King in his own house. A tankard hit the floor and rolled. Somewhere at the back, incredibly, someone was cheering, some ale-brave soul from the low tables who had watched their own child go blue on the king's charity and had liked very much hearing a lord's storehouses called a nest of thieves to a lord's face. The cheer was cut off fast, hands closed on her arms. The bench went over. Somewhere, Junia was screaming her name, and somewhere else Pell was trying to shove through to her and being thrown back. The whole golden hall tipped and blurred and filled with noise, and Vesna was hauled backward off her feet into the crush of it, craning, straining, trying to see the one thing that mattered, his face, his answer. She had thrown her whole life onto the table, and she needed to see which way it fell. The king had not moved. He stood exactly where he was in the churning hall, an island of stillness, and his lips were parting. He was going to answer, going to say the word that decided everything, and Vesna reached for it with her whole strained heart. Watched the shape of the first sound begin to form on his mouth, and then a guard's shoulder took her across the temple. And a door swung shut between them, and she was dragged out of the great hall of Ashmere into the cold of the passage beyond, before she heard a single word of it. They did not throw her in a cell, which Vesna took in the long cold hours that followed, as the worst possible sign. A cell she would have understood. A cell had a shape to it. You did a crime. You sat in the dark. Someone came to tell you the price. Instead, they marched her back to her own small room off the still house. The one that smelled of dried yarrow and tallow and 6 years of her careful, invisible life, set a guard on the door and left her there, untouched, unquestioned, forgotten, apparently, by a hold with far larger things to shout about than one herb woman. That was the part that frightened her. You did not leave a problem lying about unless you had already decided, at the very top, exactly what was to be done with it, and were only waiting for a convenient hour. She sat on the edge of her cot with her knees drawn up, and watched the light go long and gold, and then gray across the floor, and thought about the boy with the violet lips, and hoped the salt water had worked, and could not make herself regret a single word even while every sensible part of her screamed the words would get her killed. The bolt scraped near midnight. Vesna was on her feet before the door finished opening. It was Alder. The old keeper filled the low doorway the way he filled every doorway, stooped now with his years but still broad as a barn beam. Gray beard forked, and his eyes, those steady, patient eyes that had been the first kind thing she'd ever known, ran over her, checking her the way he had 1,000 times when she was small and freshly terrified of the world. He shut the door on the guard and looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "Well," in the tone of a man surveying a barn his favorite child had somehow set on fire, "you've done it now, haven't you, Mouse?" And Vesna, who had held her nerve through the poisoning, and the shouting, and the guard's shoulder across her temple, and 6 cold hours of waiting to learn whether she would live, promptly and mortifyingly burst into tears. He crossed the room and folded her into his arms, and he smelled of pipe smoke and old leather, and the cold outside, the smell of the only safe place she had ever had. Alder had found her at 14.5, starved thing with ash already smeared on her face by a mother's dying hands, and had asked her no questions. He had simply given her a corner and a trade and a reason to be small and alive, and never once in 6 years made her tell him what she was running from. "I couldn't just watch him die," she said into his coat. "He was a child. I couldn't. I know. The bread was poison. I know that too. Now," his arms tightened, "you did right by the boy. He'll live, they say. Sicked it all up, and he'll live. You did right." He set her back to look at her, and his face had gone grave under the beard. "And then you climbed on a bench in front of the whole city, and dared the Alpha King to his face on the day he came home from a war. So let's not pretend you did entirely right. Mouse, what in the wide world were you thinking? I wasn't. That was rather the trouble. Merrick's put in for you." Alder said it flat, and Vesna felt the floor drop. "Filed a claim this evening, on the beautiful stranger who shouted down the hall." His jaw worked. 2 years I've kept you off that man's plate by keeping you gray, and you undid it in one shout. If the king doesn't hang you, Marek means to have you, and I couldn't tell you tonight which is the worse road." There it was, the 2 doors, and both terrible. Vesna wiped her face on the heel of her hand and made herself think, because thinking was the only thing she had ever truly had. "The king hasn't ruled," she said slowly. 6 hours and no ruling. Why? I don't know. You always know. Not this. And that, more than the guard, or the claim, or the poison, was what turned the cold in her belly to ice, because Alder did always know. Alder had held the keys of this hold, and the ear of its stewards, for 30 years. If there was a thing Alder could not read, it was because someone far above him was keeping his own counsel, and there was only one someone above the keeper of Ashmere. He sat down heavily on the end of her cot, the way an old wolf sits, and rubbed his face with one broad hand, and for a moment he looked simply tired and old and afraid for her, and Vesna felt the guilt of it press on her chest like a stone. 30 years he'd served this hold, and never put a foot wrong, and here she was making him afraid at midnight over a girl he'd owed nothing and taken in anyway. "When your mother's people were being hunted down," he said quietly, not looking at her, and it was the nearest he had ever come, in 6 years, to naming the thing they never named, "I told myself the kindest thing I could do for you was teach you to be no one. Grind your powders, keep your head down. Grow old gray and safe and forgotten." His mouth twisted. "I should have known better. You were never built for no one, Mouse. It was always going to come out of you one day, in front of exactly the wrong people, over exactly the right thing." He sighed. "A poisoned child." Of course it was a poisoned child. "Alder, we'll fight it," he said, gathering himself, patting her knee with a hand that had never once in her life lifted against her. "Whatever he rules, we'll fight it. You're not alone in this. You've never once been alone in this. And you won't start tonight." She opened her mouth to ask him what she should do. The bolt scraped again. Both turned. The door swung, and a household page stood in it, breathless and round-eyed, a lamp shaking slightly in his grip. "The herb keeper," he said. "You're wanted now. His Majesty won't take the ruling to the stewards." He swallowed. "He'll give it to you himself." The king received her in the old muniment room where the hold's ledgers were kept, which told Vesna something before he'd said a word, though she couldn't yet have said what. It was a long, cold, high-windowed room, full to the rafters, with the written memory of Ashmere, rents and tithes and grain counts stacked in their leather sleeves back, further than anyone living had read them. Torrin stood at the far end with a single branch of candles and an open ledger, washed clean of the road at last, and the effect of him still in the candlelight was, Vesna decided grimly, entirely unfair and clearly deliberate. "They tell me a lord's put in a claim for you," he said, without looking up. "Marek, so I'm told, my lord. And that I've a herb woman in my cells, who dared me in my own hall, in front of 1,000 people, which by every custom this hold has ever kept, I am owed the right to answer, however I please." He turned a page. "Both of these things are true. You've had an eventful homecoming, for a woman who spent 6 years making certain no one would ever remember her name." At last he looked up, the pale eyes finding her across the room. "What is your name, by the way? Your real one?" "I'll settle for the one you use, Vesna." It came out of her before she decided to give it, and she hated that. "Vesna, my lord, there's no other." "There is," he said mildly, "but we'll leave it where you've buried it for now." He closed the ledger. "Here is my ruling. I decline Lord Merrick's claim." She had braced for so many things that for a moment the simple fact of not being handed to Merrick left her unable to feel anything at all. "You can do that? I can. On one ground the custom allows, and no lord can argue." He came down the room toward her, unhurried as ever, and stopped a careful arm's length off. She noticed the distance. She noticed he'd measured it. A wolf in the personal service of the crown cannot be claimed out of it. "So as of tonight, you are in my personal service." A pause, and something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "My physician, my taster, if the tithe bread's anything to go by. Whatever we want to call the woman who smells poison across a crowded room. You keep your head, you keep your freedom from Merrick, and in exchange, you do the thing you dared me to let you do. You go through this hole's rot, and you hand me the traitor at the bottom of it. 30 days. Just as you asked." It was, Vesna thought, precisely what she had demanded, and precisely not. She had asked for the storehouses and her freedom. He had given her the storehouses and a leash, a golden, protective, inescapable leash that bound her not to a post or a duty, but to him, to his household, to his person, close enough that she'd breathe the same air as the most powerful alpha in the land every day for a month while she did it. She had wanted to vanish when it was done. He had made vanishing require his permission. "That's not the boon I asked for," she said. "No, it's the one that keeps you alive, which I judged you'd want more." On reflection, he tilted his head. "You may still refuse it. The cells are always there, and so is Merrick. Shall I fetch the page back?" "No, too fast," he almost smiled. "I thought not." He studied her a moment longer. "You're angry. Go on and say it." "I've been at a war for 2 years. I've rather missed being told the truth by someone who isn't afraid of me." "You've trapped me and dressed it as a rescue," Vesna said, before her better judgment could catch her tongue. "I asked you for a door out. You've given me a very comfortable room and kept the key. I'm no less owned tonight than I was this morning, my lord. I've only changed whose collar it is." She waited for the cold, for the flash of the alpha she'd felt fill the muniment room. It didn't come. Instead, something moved behind his eyes that she could not read at all, something that looked almost like respect, and almost like guilt, and was gone before she could name either. "Yes," he said simply, "that's fair. That's exactly what I've done." He did not apologize for it, which she found she believed more than an apology. But a collar you can see is safer than a claim you can't refuse, and in 30 days you'll have earned the key off me yourself. I keep my bargains, Vesna. Ask anyone who's fought beside me. It's very nearly the only thing they'll all agree I'm good for. He reached past her, close enough that she caught, under the clean, cold water and cedar of him. Nothing of a lie. His scent was maddeningly, honestly plain. A wolf hiding exactly nothing, which no king had any right to be. And he lifted a heavy ledger off the near shelf and set it in her arms. It was the grain count for the 2 years he'd been away. Start here, he said. The spoilt rye. Walk it back. Who bought it? Who stored it? Who signed it fit? That thread's real, and it'll teach you the ground. Thank you, my lord. But it isn't where the rot is. He said it quietly, already turning away, already reaching for his candles, and the words stopped her cold with the ledger heavy in her arms. The rye's a symptom. Sloppiness covering something with a steadier hand under it. When you've followed the grain to its dead end, come and find me, and I'll tell you where to look next. And there it was, the thing that would not let her sleep that night, the small wrong note under all the rest. Because a king 2 years at a northern war, home not 1 full day, had just told a herb woman that he already knew the rot in his hold went deeper than the grain, and knew it well enough to know where the grain would dead end. Which meant he had not come home guessing. He had come home hunting. The thing about being given the run of a place is that you learn quickly how it's put together, and Vesna, who had spent 6 years learning Ashmere Hold from underneath the still house, the scullery, the servants' stairs, now learned it from the inside of its ledgers and found, unsettlingly, that the 2 versions did not match. She was good at it. That was the first surprise, and the pleasant one. Numbers lied the way people lied, confidently, and then unraveling, all at once when you pulled the loose thread, and she had spent her whole life reading the true thing under the presented one. Within a week, she had the Rye's sorry journey mapped, bought cheap and damp from a factor, since conveniently dead, stored in a cellar that flooded, signed, fit for the tithe, by a clerk who could not, when she found him, meet her eye. Sloppiness, as the king had said. A dead end, as the king had said. She stood in the flooded cellar with her lamp and understood she'd reached exactly the wall he'd told her she would, which was its own kind of unnerving. The second surprise was less pleasant, and its name was Torin. He was there. That was the thing she could not get used to. A king had 1,000 claims on his hours, and this one spent an unreasonable number of them wherever she happened to be, leaning in a storehouse doorway while she counted sacks, appearing at her elbow in the muniment room with 2 cups of something hot when she'd worked past the bells, walking the long, cold cellar at her side, with his hands behind his back and his questions coming soft and constant. And the questions, that was the note that would not stop sounding wrong. Who held Alder's keys? He asked her in the cellar. When the keeper was away. Alder is never away. He was. Twice these 2 years. I checked the rolls a fortnight each, up country on the Hold's business. He watched her face while he said it. The way he always watched, patient and thorough. So who held the keys? I don't know. I was a herb woman. I didn't watch the keys. She set down her tally stick. Why do you keep asking me about people, my lord? You set me on the grain. I'm following the grain. But you don't ask me about grain. You ask me who signed and who held keys and who all their trusts and who came and went. Those aren't questions about a bad harvest. Those are questions about a person. Something passed over his face. The first time she'd seen him caught out, gone almost before it came. Everything's about a person, in the end, he said. Grain doesn't spoil itself for profit. That's not an answer. No, he agreed pleasantly. It isn't, and would say no more. And that was somehow worse than if he'd lied. A man who declined to lie to her so smoothly that the decline itself became a wall. She'd come back to the muniment room for a tally stick she'd left and found him there before her, bent over the old payrolls with a stub of candle, running one finger down a column of names, not reading them so much as searching them, the way you search a crowd for a single face, He'd closed the roll without hurry when he heard her, and greeted her easily and asked after the flooded cellar as though nothing at all had been happening. But she'd stood in enough doorways in her gray years to know the look of a person who has just put away something they did not want seen. And Torin had worn it, plain as day, for the half-heartbeat before his face smoothed over. He was not investigating a bad harvest, he was looking for a man, and she was increasingly certain he already had a name in his mouth, and was only waiting for her to find the proof. She should have hated it, she told herself she did. The trouble was that between the wrong-noted questions there were other moments, and the other moments were the ones that lay awake with her at night. The way he'd carried a whole sack of grain up the cellar stair himself, rather than watch her strain at it, and made a joke of it so she wouldn't feel the courtesy. The way he'd asked once, quietly, whether the boy from the hall had truly lived and had listened to her answer as though it mattered more than the ledgers. The way he never, not once, in a whole week of standing close enough to, never let his eyes go down her the way Marex had. He looked at her face, he looked at her mind. And no one, in 6 years of being nobody, had done Vesna the terrible discourtesy of looking at her mind. She'd hidden her beauty, and he had seen through it in a heartbeat. What frightened her was that she'd hidden everything else too, and he seemed determined to see through all of it, one patient question at a time, and some traitorous part of her had begun, faintly, to want him to. She was thinking exactly that, and despising herself for it, on the 9th night, alone in the muniment room past the last bell, when she found the second ledger. It was small, and it was wrong, and it was tucked behind the grain counts, where it had no business being a private tally in a cramped, careful hand, columns of stores and coin that appeared nowhere in the great rolls, moving quietly out of Ashmere and into nothing over the whole 2 years the king had been at war. A steady hand, a patient hand, exactly the steadier hand the king had told her to look for under the sloppiness of the rye. Relief hit her first. She'd found it. The real rot, the thread that would buy back her freedom. Then she turned to the front of the little book to find whose hand had kept it, read the name, inked, small and neat inside the cover. And every warm and foolish thing in her went to ash at once. She knew that hand. She had watched it teach her letters by a fire when she was 14. She had trusted it with her life and never once thought twice. The private ledger, the one the king had all but promised, lay at the bottom of everything, was written in the hand of Alder the keeper. She did not hand the little ledger to the king. She told herself all the sensible reasons why. That one book proved nothing on its own, that a name inside a cover was not a confession. That she owed Alder who had pulled her out of the dirt, who had never asked her what she was, who had sat on the end of her cot at midnight and vowed she would not be alone. She owed him, at the very least, the chance to explain, a thing she was certain, had an explanation. She slid the ledger under the loose flag beneath her cot, where she had once kept the only other dangerous thing she owned, and she went about her work with it, burning a hole in the floor of the room and the floor of her chest both. The trouble was the king. The trouble was always the king. He found her on the east wall 3 nights later, where she'd gone to be somewhere the ledger wasn't. It was cold and clear, the lower city spread beneath them in its scatter of lamplight, and Torin came and leaned his forearms on the parapet beside her, without a word, close but not too close, always that measured distance, as though he'd decided long ago how much of himself he was allowed to give. "You've gone quiet," he said, at last. "Quieter? You found something." "I found a great deal. Damp cellars, a dead factor, a clerk who can't look at me. That's not what I meant, and you know it isn't." He looked out over the city instead. "Do you want to know how I knew, in the hall, that you were more than a gray woman with a good nose?" She did. God's help her, she did. "I've never been able to help it," he said, and something in his voice changed. The easy king's voice gone, and under it something younger and more tired. "Whatever's true in a person, I can feel the shape of it, not thoughts. Just the true thing under the shown thing. My whole life. Do you know what that does to a man? Every bow in that hall is a lie of some kind. Every smile has a want behind it, and I feel all of them, all day, like grit under the eyelid. He turned his head and looked at her, and the pale eyes were, for once, entirely undefended. And then a woman climbs up on a bench with poison in her nose and rage in her mouth and shouts the truth at me across 1,000 liars, and doesn't want a single thing from me while she does it. Do you understand? You were the first restful thing I'd seen in 10 years. I could have wept. Instead, I said, there you are, like a fool, in front of my whole court. Vesna's throat had gone tight. This was the danger she had never learned to hide from, because she had never once met it, not the eyes on her body, which she knew how to survive, but a man who looked at the true thing under everything and, having seen it, wanted to sit beside it in the cold and say so. That's a lonely gift, she said quietly. It's a lonely everything. He smiled crookedly. You'd know. And for a moment, one long, dangerous moment on the cold wall with the city breathing below, she let herself be seen. She didn't reach for the ash that wasn't there, or the gray stoop, or any of the 6 years of armor. She just stood in the truth of herself, beside a man who could feel the shape of it and let it be. And it was the most exposed she had ever been, with her clothes on, and it did not feel like drowning. It felt like coming up for air. When I was small, she heard herself say, and she never spoke of when she was small, and could not afterward explain why she did then. My mother taught me a game. She'd tell me 3 things, one of them false, and I had to find the false one by the smell of her. I always could. I thought everyone's mother played it. The wind pulled at her hair. I was 9 before I understood. It wasn't a game. It was a lesson, the one thing that would get me killed, taught until I knew it well enough to hide it. And then men came, and she rubbed ash on my face with her own dying hands, and she stopped. She had never said this much aloud in her life. Torrin didn't move to comfort her, which was somehow exactly right. He only said, quietly, and you've been finding the false thing in every room since, never once allowed to say so. It wasn't a question. That's a hard way to carry a gift. Alone in the dark, calling it a curse. It is a curse, is it? He looked out over his sleeping city. You smelled poison in a loaf and a child's alive because of it. I don't think a curse does that. And he let it sit there. The small, enormous reframing of the thing she'd hated her whole life, and did not press it. And that was the moment. She would decide later that the real trouble began. She told Junia the next morning because she had to tell someone. Or burst. You've gone soft on the king, Junia said flatly over the washtubs. I have not. You've the exact face my sister had before she did something extremely stupid. With a Fletcher, Junia wrung a sheet like a neck. You hid your whole self away for 6 years, so no man would get his hooks in. And now the one man who could hang you with a word has you mooning on a wall. Tell me I'm wrong. And here was the confession she'd carried down the servant's stair, like a stone. You're not wrong, she said, very low. That's what frightens me. It's real, Junia. It's the realest thing I've got, and I don't know how to want something I can't hide. Junia's face softened. She opened her mouth. And a page came to the wash-house door, breathless as always, to say the king wanted his physician in the muniment room, and would she bring whatever she'd found on the steadier hand, because he had a feeling he'd said that she'd found it days ago. Vesna's blood went to water. She walked the long way up. And when she stood in front of Torrin in the candlelight, and he looked at her, the man who felt the shape of every true thing, and asked her plainly whether she had found the hand under the rot, she looked him dead in his knowing eyes, and for the first time in her life tried to tell an outright lie. No, she said. Nothing yet. The word came out wrong in her own ears, flat and false, and hers. She watched him hear it, she watched him know. And she watched him, worst of all, decide to let it lie there between them, unchallenged, his jaw tightening a fraction as he nodded and turned away. Because a man who cannot be lied to had just been lied to by the one person he'd let himself trust, and was choosing, for reasons she couldn't fathom, to say nothing at all. She went to Alder that night, unable to carry it 1 hour longer. He was in the keeper's study among his 30 years of order, pipe-lit spectacles down his nose over a roll of accounts, and he looked up at her with the same unguarded gladness he'd had since she was 14, and Vesna nearly turned and walked back out and let the whole thing rot in the dark rather than break the last true thing she had. Instead, she set the little ledger on his desk. She watched his face when he saw it, the moment she would carry the rest of her life, not the shouting that came after, not the great haul, but this. The exact instant the gladness went out of Alder's face and became something old and tired and unsurprised. He did not gasp. He did not deny. He looked at the ledger, and then he looked at her, and he set down his pipe with great care, and he said, "Ah, so he set you on me after all. I did wonder, the floor of the world, tilted. He set me." She could not get the sentence out. "Tell me you didn't. Tell me there's an explanation. I came here so you could tell me." "There's an explanation," Alder said heavily. "There always is, Mouse. It's only that you won't like it and it won't make me innocent, and I'm too old to pretend otherwise, to your face." He took off the spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Yes, it's my hand. Yes, I've been bleeding this whole 2 years, and longer. And yes, that's the part you came to hear, isn't it? The king knew it was me before he ever laid eyes on you. He came home for me. I've enemies enough at that court to have warned me of it." "Then why?" Her voice cracked clean down the middle. "Why me?" "Because you're the one creature in Ashmere I would never lie to." Alder said it gently, and it was the gentleness that gutted her. "And the one who'd know it if I did. He's a clever wolf, our king. He worked out what you were, I don't know how, but he did, and that I loved you. And he put the two together and got the only key in the world that fits my lock. A truth center I'd open the whole of myself to without thinking twice." His old eyes were wet and steady. "He aimed you at me like an arrow, girl, and you flew true. You were always going to. It's what you are. Why did you do it?" It came out of her small and cracked, the child's voice, the 14-year-old's. "You held the keys of a whole hold for 30 years. What did you need to steal for?" "I didn't do it for coin." Something old and hard moved under the grief in his face. "You want to know the ugly heart of it, Mouse. Sit. No, you won't sit. You never could when you were frightened." He sighed, and for a moment, he was not the man who'd taught her letters, but someone older and colder she'd never been allowed to see. "The Ashmere line hunted your mother's people into ash for the crime of being unable to lie and unable to be lied to. Kings do so hate a truth they can't manage. I watched it happen. I was young, and I held a torch for men I called my betters. And I have spent 40 years since knowing I helped burn out the last honest thing this country had. Taking you in didn't unburn it." His jaw set. "So when men came to me, 2 years gone, with a plan to pull the whole rotten Ashmere line up by the root, a lord with gold and grievance, a chance to end the dynasty that lit those fires, I told myself it was justice. I told myself a great many things, and I bled the whole to pay for it, and I told myself that too." Vesna could not breathe. "You took me in," she whispered, "out of guilt. I took you in because I loved you within a week and never stopped." Fierce, now, and wet. Both are true. That's the thing you're too young yet to know, that both are always true. I loved you like my own, and I was betraying your king, and I'd have gone on doing both to the grave, if a boy with a war behind him hadn't come home and pointed you at me. Don't you dare think I didn't love you. It's the only clean thing I've got left, and I won't have him or you take it off me." The floor of the world tilted. Every night on the wall, every soft question about keys, and coming and going. Every moment she'd stood in the truth of herself and thought, "He sees me, he sees me, and all of it had been a hand on the small of her back, steering her gently toward the one man she'd have died before suspecting, because she was the perfect instrument, and Torrin Ashmere had known it from the first breath he took in that hall. There you are, of course. Of course there you are. He'd been looking for exactly this. He'd found his weapon, and told it that it was beautiful. She did not remember leaving Alder's study. She remembered the corridor and the cold. And then she remembered the muniment room door under her hand, and Torrin turning from the shelves with her name half-formed on his mouth, and the beginning of that hopeful, uncertain look she'd been such a fool for. You knew it was him. Her voice came out terrible and flat. From the start, before the hall, before me. You needed someone Alder would never hide from. Someone who could smell a lie off the man who raised her, and then a truth center climbed onto a bench in your hall and handed herself to you, and you couldn't believe your luck. She was shaking. Every question, the wall you aimed me. He didn't deny it. That was the whole of it, the entire wound in one motion. He had the chance, and he did not take it. His face simply fell, the hope going out of it, the way it had gone out of Alder's. And he said, Vesna, low and wrecked, and reached out one hand toward her. You used me, the words tore. You made me betray the only father I've ever had, and you let me think it was love. It became, don't. She was already at the door. Don't you dare say what it became. And she walked out, into the dark of the corridor, with the sound of him saying her name behind her like something breaking. He came after her, of course. Kings are not accustomed to closed doors. He caught her in the long gallery under the portraits of his own dead line, the fathers whose faces she'd passed for 6 years, the very men who had hunted her mother's people into ash, and stopped an arm's length off, because even now, even breaking, he would not crowd her. Ask me anything you like, he said. I'll not lie to you. I've never lied to you, Vesna, not once. I only failed to tell you the shape of the hole. Ask. Why didn't you simply arrest him? She rounded on him. You're the king. You suspected the keeper. Take him. Question him. You didn't need me. You didn't need to make me the knife. Because Alder holds the loyalty of every steward and half the guard in this hold, and an old name behind him, and friends I still can't fully count. The steadiness frayed at last. She saw the war weariness under it. If I dragged the keeper to a cell on a king's hunch, home not a month, with no proof, a single one of them couldn't wave away, as a young king's spite, there'd have been blood on these flagstones by the next dawn, steward against steward. The lower city in flames over their beloved keeper. I have watched exactly that happen in the north, to men who moved too soon. I could not touch him until I had a thing. Not one wolf alive could argue with. His jaw worked. A truth no faction could call a lie. And there is only one kind of truth like that in all the world. And it walked into my hall, and it had ash on its face. It was a good answer. That was the unbearable part. Sound to the bone, the answer of a man trying to spare a city the very blood she'd have spared it too, and she hated that it was good, hated that she could find no crack in it to pour her fury through. A good reason, she said, doesn't undo it. No, he didn't argue. It doesn't. I know it doesn't. You knew what I was. From the start, you knew the one word that could see me killed the way my mother's whole line was killed. And you carried it in your pocket the whole time you were aiming me. Her voice shook. And I stood on that wall and thought, here at last is a man who'd never use what I am against me. I never did. He said it fast and fierce, and it stopped her. Hear me if you hear nothing else. I have known what you are since the moment you knelt over that boy. I could have used it 100 ways, owned you outright with a single word to the wrong ear. I never spoke it. Not to Alder, not to my stewards, not to the empty room. I protected the one thing that could destroy you every single day while I let you go on hating me for the smaller thing. His breath came ragged. The aiming was real. I'll carry that, but so was the rest. Somewhere between the hall and that wall, it stopped being a use, and became the only hour of my day I looked forward to, and I was too great a coward to tell you, because I knew. The moment you learned how it began, you'd never believe how it ended. And here we are, I was right, and I'd give my crown to have been wrong. She stood in the gallery of his murderous fathers, and felt the truth of every word of it land in her, because she could not help but feel it. She was what she was, and that was the cruelest thing of all. He was not lying. Not one word. The bond of it, the real of it, poured off him unguarded, and she had no ash in the world that could stop her knowing it was true. "Do you know what the worst of it is?" she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, which was worse than shouting. "It isn't that you used me. Men have wanted to use me my whole life. I built 6 years of armor for exactly that. It's that you found the one gap in the armor. You didn't want my face, or my body, or even my nose. You wanted the part of me my own mother died to hide, the part I've never once been able to show a living soul, and you saw it in a heartbeat and you used it. And for 1 month you made me believe being seen like that could be safe." She was shaking. "You've ruined the only thing I had left to hope for. I can hide my face from the next man. I can't ever unknow that the one time I let someone see the whole of me, he'd already worked out how to aim it. That reached him." She watched it go in like the knife she'd catch in the hall a night later, watched him absorb it and not defend against it because there was no defending against it because it was true. "That," he said at last, hoarse, "is the fairest and most terrible thing anyone has ever said to me, and I have no answer to it. I only have the rest of my life. If you'd ever let me spend it proving that being seen by me is the safest thing that will ever happen to you." He shook his head slowly. "But I know I forfeited the right to ask you to believe that. I aimed you. I'll carry it to the pyre. It changed nothing. A truth you can feel is still a truth you were used to reach. I'm glad Alder will face justice," she said, and her voice was, "Osh. I'm glad the hold will be clean. I did my duty, and I'd do it again." She stepped back. "But I can't trust you. I don't know that I ever will again. And I think some part of you always knew that was the price, and aimed me anyway." She saw it land. She saw him understand that he'd broken a thing no crown could mend. She turned to go, and a bell began to hammer, high and wild and wrong from the direction of the keeper's wing, and then a second bell, and a third, and Torrens's head snapped up, and every trace of the wrecked man went out of him, and the alpha came down like a blade, because those were not tithe bells or watch bells. Those were the bells that rang when someone had decided not to wait for justice at all. Alder had not run. That was the thing Vesna understood as she ran. Flat out Torren at her shoulder, guards spilling from every archway, that a man who means to flee does not ring every bell in his own wing. Alder had rung them on purpose, calling his people to him. The stewards and the half of the guard, whose loyalty he'd bought over 30 years, in the open tonight. Because a cornered old wolf with nothing left to lose does not go quietly to a cell. He burns the house down instead. They came into the great hall, the same hall, the poison hall, already filling with men, torchlight, and drawn steel and shouting. The hold, splitting down its oldest seam. At the head of it stood Alder, and beside him, soft and gold and smiling at last, Lord Marek, and Vesna understood the whole shape of it in one sick instant. The keeper who held the guard, and the lord who wanted a crown, braided together 2 long years, funded out of the hold's own stolen stores. Waiting for the boy king to come home and put his head in the noose. "Torren Ashmere," Marek's voice rang out golden over the hall. "Your keeper brings a grievance, and half your house stands with him. Set down the crown, and there needn't be a single the cup," Vesna said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. She had simply smelled it, the way she'd smelled the tithe bread across 1,000 people, threaded through the torch smoke and fierce sweat and oiled steel. The faint, sweet, violet wrongness of monkshood, close, very close, in the king's own cup, that a trembling page was at that very moment carrying toward Torren's hand. Because the page had been told to, because the plan beneath the plan had never been steal at all. Steal was the distraction, the poison was the point. Kill the king quietly, call it a weak heart, and let Merrick weep at the funeral. "Don't drink it," she shouted, and knocked it from the page's hands. The cup rang on the flagstones. The violet-sweet reek of it bloomed up between them, unmistakable now to every wolf nose in the hall, and the whole room saw it, saw the king's cup poisoned in the open, saw the truth of the thing Merrick had just dressed up as a grievance, and for one held breath nobody moved at all. Then Alder stepped forward and lifted his old voice over the hall, and Vesna understood he meant to do the one thing that could still save the plan. He meant to lie, and to have these people, who'd trusted him 30 years, believe him over their own noses. "She's the king's creature," Alder called out, steady as stone. "Bought and kept," she'd say, "and smell whatever he—" "Then smell me," Vesna said. She turned to the sea of wavering, torch-lit faces, the stewards who had loved their keeper, the guards who hadn't yet chosen a side, the whole seam of the hold hanging open and undecided, and she did the only thing she had ever truly been able to do. She stopped hiding. She let every scrap of the ash-covered, wormwood-masked, 6 years buried truth of herself rise up off her skin into the smoke of that hall, unmistakable, undeniable, the thing the Ashmere kings had burned her mother's whole line to be rid of, and she told them the plainest truth she had, and dared them to find a lie in it. "He's been robbing you for 2 years, to buy that lord a crown. The spoilt bread that near killed a child in this very hall. That was his rot, not neglect, not luck, his. And now, he'd poison your king in his own cup and call it a weak heart. You've known me a month and you've known him 30 years, so don't take my word. Take your own noses. Smell the cup, smell him, smell me. One of us, in this hall, cannot lie to you, if her life depended on it. And every wolf here can tell which." Her voice cracked up the vaulted stone. "Which of us is lying?" They could smell it. The terrible gift, laid bare at last in front of the whole hold, the gift a dynasty had murdered a bloodline to erase, standing in the open and doing the exact thing it had been born to do. She could not lie, and a room full of wolves could smell that she could not. And they could smell, too, the sour thread of the lie curling off their beloved old keeper, who had never in 30 years let them catch him at it, and could not stop them now. Not with a truth center 3 feet away throwing the whole truth of the room into the light. The seam that had split the hold began, waveringly, to close. The wrong way for Merrick, the wrong way for Alder. Steel lowered all down the hall. A steward near the front made a low, sick sound. The sound of a man who has just realized which side of a burning house he is standing on. Merrick, being what he was, did not wait to be taken. He gave up the crown for the simpler thing. Vesna saw it before Torin did. Saw the Gold Lord abandon the grand plan in an instant and lunge, a thin knife dropping out of his sleeve into his palm, straight for the king who stood astride away, with his eyes still on his turning, wavering people. There was no time to shout. There was no time to think. She did not decide to move, any more than she'd decided to move for the choking boy a year before. The deciding part of her was nowhere in it. She was simply there, between the blade and the king, catching Merrick's knife arm at the wrist with both her hands and all her weight and wrenching it wide, and the blade, robbed of Torin's throat, opened a long line of white fire across her own forearm instead. Then the guards were on Merrick, 4 of them, and he went down under the weight, and it was over. It was over so fast that the pain in her arm arrived late, almost as an afterthought. A hot, wet blooming she watched with strange detachment as it dripped off her fingers and pattered on the stone. The great hall of Ashmere roared, not in fear now, but in something closer to a single, enormous exhale. 1,000 wolves who had watched a poisoning stopped, and a traitor unmasked, and a gray herb woman throw her own body across their king. She stood bleeding, and Torin's hands came to her shoulders, his face wide open. terror and gratitude and 100 things she could not afford, and she made herself say it first, cold and clear, before he could say a single one of them. "It was duty," she said. "You're the king. Keeping you breathing is my job. That's all it was." She stepped out from under his hands. "Don't mistake it for forgiveness." And she watched the light go out of his face, and she turned, and she let them take Alder away. The old wolf did not fight it. He only found her eyes across the ruined hall and mouthed something that might have been "good girl" or might have been "forgive me," and she would never be sure. And she carried the not being sure the rest of her life. And she walked out of the hall she had saved, holding her own bleeding arm, and did not let one single soul see her weep until the door was shut. She had thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong, in the way that people who have decided to be lonely are usually wrong. The hold healed fast, the way a body heals, once the rot is cut clean. Marek went to the deepest cell under the old fort. Alder went to a quieter one. And the king, she heard this third hand, and pretended not to care, visited the old man twice, and neither of them ever said what passed between them. The stolen stores were traced and returned. The East Barracks got their grain. And the lower city, which had watched a gray herb woman shout down a poisoning and then throw herself on a blade for a king, decided all at once that it loved them both, and told the story in the taverns with such embellishment that within a month Vesna had reportedly killed 6 men barehanded, and Torin had caught the poisoned cup out of the air with his teeth, and Torin kept his bargain, the thing she had not braced for. She'd handed him his traitor inside of 10 days, but he let the full 30 run their course, keeping her name safe under crown protection until the very last hour the custom allowed. And on the 30th day exactly, he sent for her and put a folded paper in her hand, her freedom, plain and legal, her release from crown service, signed and sealed. The key off his own collar, just as he'd promised. "You've earned it twice over," he said. "You're free of me, Vesna. Go where you like. Be no one, if that's still what you want, though I think you'd find the city won't let you anymore." He'd hesitated, only a moment. "And if you'd rather stay, not in service, not owing me a thing, there's a place for a truth center at the right hand of a king who's tired of being lied to. But that's your choice, and it comes with nothing attached. Not even me. Especially not me." She'd taken the paper and not answered, and he'd let her go. He courted her the way a proud man courts when he's decided he has no right to. Not with flowers and letters, that would have been easy to refuse. With small, quiet, undeniable things. A better lamp appeared in the still house, without a word, because he'd noticed she worked past the bells. The book she'd read forbidden, and second-hand at 14. The one about the poisons, a clean new copy of it turned up on her workbench, no note. When the boy from the tithe hall, fully recovered, was taken on as her apprentice, she knew whose doing it was, and he never once claimed it. He asked nothing. He simply, patiently, kept being true at her, day after day, which was the one form of courtship a truth center could not disbelieve, and the one she had no armor against. And there were the other things, the ones that undid her worse than any gift, the ones he plainly didn't mean her to see. The way he'd fall silent when she came into a council chamber, and lose the thread of what he'd been saying, and have to find it again. The way he'd taken to walking the east wall himself at the hour she used to walk it, as though the stones might have kept some warmth of her. Junia reported, with the grim relish of a woman vindicated, that half the household now had a wager running on the two of them, and that the odds were not kind to Vesna's principles. "He saved this whole hold," Junia said, folding linens with unnecessary violence. "You saved his life. He kept his bargain to the very hour, and set you free when he could have kept you. He protected your neck when your neck was the one card that would have won him everything. And he still not once, not one time, tried to touch you or trap you or press an advantage. Vesna, my love, what on earth is the man supposed to do? He used me, he did, a year ago, to catch a man who was poisoning children." Junia set the linens down. You want to talk about who used who? That old traitor you call the father used your whole heart for 30 years, and you've forgiven him enough to weep over his cell. But the man who used you for 1 month to save a city and has spent every day since trying to earn it back, him you'll freeze in a corridor forever. Where's the sense in it? There wasn't any. That was the thing Vesna could not say aloud. There was no sense in it at all. Only fear. Only the 6-year habit of a creature who had learned that being wanted was the most dangerous thing that could happen to her. And habits, she was learning, do not care in the least whether they still make sense. She held the line anyway. For weeks she held it, out of principle, out of the memory of the gallery. And there you are and the sick understanding of having been aimed. She would not be made a fool of, twice. She told herself so, on the wall, in the dark, every night, while the true thing under her own ribs called her a coward in a voice that sounded remarkably like Junia. And then, in the 7th week, he stopped. There was no scene. That was how she knew he meant it. He came to her one evening, tired and kind, and finally, truly resigned, and said, "I've been unfair to you. Staying near, hoping. It's its own kind of pressure, a king who keeps hoping at you. You've made yourself clear, a dozen ways. And I've kept pretending not to hear it." He'd almost smiled. "So, I'll hear it now. I'll stop. You're free and you're safe. And you'll not have to spend one more evening bracing for me to hope at you across a room. I'm sorry. It took me this long to give you the one thing you actually asked for. Peace." And he'd nodded, and gone, and kept his word. No lamp, no book, no showing up. When she passed him in the corridors, he inclined his head, Vesna even and warm and final, and walked on. Never cold, just done. This is what you wanted, she told herself. That first empty week, she did her work, and did it well. And every night, the true thing under her ribs stayed exactly where it was, warm and patient and unbearable, until she understood what she'd been too proud and too frightened to understand, that she had spent 6 years learning to live unseen, and had somehow, catastrophically, forgotten how. It was Tithe Day again when she stopped hiding. A whole year, near enough, since she'd climbed onto a bench in this same hall, with ash on her face and rage in her mouth. The city poured in again to pay and be fed, and Vesna stood by the 3rd pillar again with her satchel, but there was no ash on her jaw this time, no wormwood at her collar, and the gray wrap was folded away in a drawer in the stillhouse, left there the morning she finally admitted she was tired of being water the light slid off of. She stood in the truth of her own face in a crowded hall, and let people see it, and the strange thing no one had ever told her in 6 years of hiding was that mostly they simply nodded, and said good morning, and went on. The world did not end when she let it look at her. Torin sat the dais, and did his king's work, and did not look at her, because he had given his word not to hope, and he was a man who kept his word even when it was killing him, and she could see, she could always see, that it was. So, she supposed one of them would have to be reckless, and supposed, given their history, that it would have to be him, because a mirror only works if it turns the picture round. She was wrong about that, too. She never got the chance to plan a gesture, because the king rose from his chair in the middle of the tithe feast, in front of the whole assembled city, and came down off the dais. The hall went quiet, the way it had a year ago, all at once. From the top, stewards half rose. Torin ignored them. He crossed to the 3rd pillar, where the herb woman stood, and stopped in front of her, close now, the careful arm's length abandoned at last. And Torin Ashmere, king of the hold, who felt the shape of every true thing and had spent 7 weeks keeping a promise that was hollowing him out, broke his own given word in front of 1,000 witnesses. "I said I'd stop hoping," he said, low, just for her, though the whole leaning hall strained to hear. "I lied. It's the only lie I've ever told you, and I find I can't keep it. I don't want peace, Vesna. Peace is unbearable. I'd rather be told no to my face every morning of my life than have one more even, polite corridor nod from the one person who ever saw the point of me. His voice was not steady. A king's voice, in front of his city, and it was not remotely steady. So here I am, no crown to it, no bargain, no aiming, nothing behind it. But the plain thing you can smell for yourself. Marry me, I dare you a breath. I know exactly what I'm asking. I know what I did. Ask me to spend the rest of my life proving it began wrong and ended true, and I will. Only stop making me nod at you in corridors. It's killing me, and you can tell that it's killing me, which is a shameful advantage for a woman to have. The whole hall held its breath. Vesna looked at him, the man who'd come down off his dais, the way she'd once climbed onto a bench. The picture turned round at last, and she felt the whole plain, true, undefended want of him pour off him unguarded. No mask, no angle. The man who could not be lied to, laying himself open with no defense at all in front of everyone he ruled. Somewhere near the low tables, a familiar voice. Pell, of course it was Pell, said far too loudly. Oh! Just say yes, the pair of you are unbearable. And the whole terrified hall broke into helpless laughter, and even that did not make Torin look away from her. He waited. A year ago, she had stood on a bench, certain she'd won something. Now, she understood what winning had looked like all along. A man who would put his crown on a chair and his pride on the floor and simply wait, in front of his whole world, to be told no. She could have said yes. Every true thing in her wanted to. She didn't. Not there. Not with the hall watching and the crown on the chair behind him and a year of ash still washing out of her. Ask me again, she said softly, when there's no hall watching. No dais. No city holding its breath so you can't take it back. She let herself, at last, reach up and lay one hand flat against his chest, over the true thing hammering there, and felt his breath stop. Ask me in the still house tomorrow, with grain dust in the air and no one to perform. 4. Ask me when it cost you nothing but the asking. Her own voice broke, finally, and she let it. And I'll say yes, but I want the man, Torin. Not the gesture. I've had enough of being anyone's grand moment. Ask me small, and mean it, and find out. And the Alpha King of Ashmere, in front of his whole astonished city, began, helplessly and then completely, to smile. In the end, it took him 9 days, because he was a king, and kings have terrible trouble doing anything small. He tried the still house the next morning, as instructed, grain dust and all, and got as far as her doorway before Pell and 2 scullions and the recovered tithe boy all turned out to be suspiciously present, having heard, and it was not small, and Vesna laughed him out of the room. He tried the east wall, and a watch change ruined it. He tried once with so many flowers crammed into the still house that the place smelled like a spring funeral, and she couldn't find her yarrow for a week. Each time she sent him off to ask again, smaller, and each time he went hangdog and hopeful, and each time she stood at the window afterward with her hand pressed over the warm, patient thread under her ribs and smiled where no one could see. On the 9th day he came to the still house at dawn, with no flowers, no crown, no audience, no plan she could detect at all. He was alone, and rumpled, and he leaned in her doorway, with grain dust turning gold, in the early light, and he said, simply, tiredly, hopefully, "Marry me." And Vesna, who had spent 6 years making certain no living soul would ever see her, looked up from her workbench at the one man who had refused, from the very first breath, to look away, and said, yes. He wept at the wedding. She'd known he would, she very nearly didn't. The whole city agreed. It was a near thing, but the true thing under her ribs gave her away entirely. And he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw her face. There you are, he murmured. When it was done, the same 3 words he'd said across a poisoned hall a year before, to a gray woman who'd spent her whole life making sure no one ever could. Here I am, she said. No taking it back. Why would I? Said the Alpha King. who had seen the real her before she'd let a single other soul so much as look, when I only ever wanted to find you in the first place.